Welcome to World Events in the Bible. I'm Brandon T. Ward. Hey, today we're going to talk about how we got the Bible and its history. It's really important for us Christians to know these type of things. I mean, we've placed our entire hope and faith on this book that we call the Bible. But where did all the books come from that make up the Bible? So we're going to kind of dive into that today. It's not going to be a real deep dive. It's just going to be enough to kind of make you dangerous, basically. The first thing let's talk about is the ancient manuscripts. And the manuscripts are the ancient writings that have came down through the years in different languages. We have Greek and Hebrew, and they formed the backbone of our Bible. They formed the Bible. The thing that's important to realize is the original manuscripts they're gone with time. So, you know, the ancient writings of Moses and things like that. I mean, those things don't exist. Now, what does exist is thousands and thousands of different manuscripts, fragments, and different pieces of the Bible that, thank God, that we have today. And they're in museums. You can go view these things. But what I'm trying to make the point about is the original writings of, say, Moses, for example, doesn't exist. They're just too old. They've just gone away with time. So over the years, man has basically not translated, but made copies of those manuscripts. And now that is what we have today. We have copies of the original. And that's how it's gone on. And that's how we have our Bible today. What is interesting to note is there's actually over 20,000 different biblically based manuscripts. Some of these are entire collections of the Old Testament, entire collections of the New Testament as well. Some are just little pieces of fragment paper, and so on. It's really interesting. And a lot of people give the Bible a bad rap, or they'll say, oh, well, how can we trust this and that? Well, there's 20,000 manuscripts in total, and there is some little variation, but all scholars will tell you it's not enough to make a difference. It doesn't change the word, actually. It does not change the meaning of the Bible whatsoever. There are some differences here and there, but it's not enough to change God's word. I find that so interesting, that 20,000 number, as some of the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, there's two in general, and out of all their writings that they have that only exist today is like a dozen. That's it, 12. And nobody doubts their writings. Nobody puts it under a spotlight and says that those writings aren't real. But we do that when it comes to the Bible, when there's 20,000, at least 20,000. So it's very special. That I think it's kind of like a sign from God showing how much care has been placed on this word by different people. It's not like just one group had this and kept it in store over the years. It's numerous people that have done it, and it's just a very cool thing. The other thing I wanted to mention about the Greek historians and the Roman historians there that I mentioned to earlier is the difference in their writings from their original copy, because their original one doesn't really exist either, is hundreds of years to 1,300 years from the original writing. So that's something else to kind of take note of, where the New Testament is actually only a few hundred years off from its original writing that it goes back to. So it's very, very impressive, and something as a Christian that I think you should really be aware of, because when you learn this story about how we got the Bible, it actually increases your faith. I know it did for me. Not that my faith was lacking, but I think just to understand the history of the book and how we got it is really important. There's a book I learned some of these things in. It's called How We Got the Bible by Neil Lightfoot. You can get it on a Christian bookstore or something like that. We don't sell any books or anything like that, so check your local Christian bookstore, online retailer. I highly recommend that book, How We Got the Bible by Neil Lightfoot. In that book, you can also learn there's some different manuscripts that have really changed the course of history for the Bible. They've just given it so much more evidence of being real, and for the doubters, for people who doubt the Word of God. I just want to share a little bit of one story. There's this manuscript called the Sinaitic Manuscript that was found in about the 1850s. And take that, the King James Bible was originally written 200 years before that, so those scholars didn't have this manuscript. But there's this gentleman, a Christian scholar named Tischendorf. I'm probably messing up his name real bad there. I don't think he'll mind. And he had went to Sinai, and he went to this little monastery basically at the base of the mountain there. And he found these manuscripts when he went in there and he was talking to them. I mean, that's what he was looking for. And he showed a little bit too much excitement about it, and it tipped off the monks there that these manuscripts that they had were actually sitting by the burn pile, and the people had explained how some of them had already gone into the burn pile. And so when he showed so much excitement over those manuscripts, they didn't let him see him anymore, only while he was there on his visit, and they kind of kept it under wraps. So it was kind of a shame there. But in this story, you'll actually learn that 15 years later, he comes back to the same place. He's talking to these people, and they explain that they've read the Septuagint, a really old version of the Bible. And this gentleman pulls down from the top shelf this big book and scrolls with a big red covering over the top. And this Tischendorf gentleman opens it up, and he realizes what it turns out to be is the Sinaitic Manuscript. And what's so special about this book is it's 1,600 years old. It is the oldest, most complete Bible in the entire word. And I'm using the word Bible, and I shouldn't be. It's a manuscript. It had the original Greek and Hebrew in there. It's just amazing. And he knew once he had it in his hand that this was just something special. But he had to contain his happiness in front of him, because the last time it kind of backfired on him. So he controlled himself, and then later that evening, he asked, basically kind of just carelessly, if he could look at it in his room for the night, kind of peruse the pages. And he did, and when he closed the door of his private study, he just kind of broke down, and he just couldn't even write his emotions, because he knew what he found was something that would forever change Christianity. And it did. And so it's just, I never knew that until I started reading some of the history and everything, and I just think it's so important for everybody to understand some of those things. It really puts stock in the Bible, I think, even more than it already has. But so the gist of all that is there's just so much more documentation, manuscripts, and evidence of all the books that contain our Bible than any other historical writing in the history of the world. That's not an accident. Over time, man had translated these copies of the ancient copies of these ancient languages into the English, so we could have our Bible today. So over time, actually, these translations in the English became translations of translations. So you kind of had the Bible, the English Bible, rewritten several times by different translators. I'll explain some more of that in just a moment. But what's kind of another thing that is important to think about and interesting, I think, is all throughout history, people that wanted to learn about God and everything and Jesus, they didn't have access to the stuff that we have. There were scrolls, and maybe a village or, a town had a few here and there, and maybe there was somebody there, the pastor or whatnot, whatever they called them way back in those days, had access to it, and sometimes the people could see it, right? But today, everybody can have a copy of the Bible. We have at least 7 in our home. I have different softwares on my computer, my cell phone, my tablet of the Bible. It's just, we can have it anywhere we want, and I'm sure many of you already have the same thing as well. But it's just kind of to relay the point how we are so blessed in the time period we live in today, but we kind of take advantage of it, I think is some of that. But all this first section kind of wraps up what Jesus said in Matthew 24:35. I want to read it. He says, "Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away." I think that statement is true now more than it has ever have been. The Bible will never go away now. All those manuscripts that I mentioned earlier have crept down through this time for the generation, the last 400 years maybe, and now we have the Bible everywhere. It's not ever going to go away. So Jesus was absolutely right. Not that we would expect anything less. A little bit of history about the English Bible. I want to jump into that now. The father of the English Bible is known by a man by the name of William Tyndale. And this guy, he really, if you read about him, he really put it all out there. He wanted to put the ancient languages into the English language so the common guy could have it. The people could have the Bible. He's actually quoted saying that he wanted a plowboy to be able to know as much as a scholar. That was what he really wanted. So, and he did that. For the example that I've already written through his work and the people who followed him, they made it a reality. And it wasn't easy. They had to go out on a limb. They had to do things that ruined their life. Like Tyndale, they staked him and they burned him until he was dead. I mean, he went through harsh punishment to make a stand for God. And if people like him didn't do that then, we wouldn't have the Bible that we have today. And to be honest with you, we wouldn't have the freedoms that we have today, especially in this country that I live in, is the United States. The next thing I want to talk about is the King James Bible. Now, the King James Bible, a lot of people think it actually came from, the manuscripts. It was an original copy from the ancient languages into the English. That's actually not true. It's just not true. The King James Bible was a revision of the Bishop's Bible of 1568, of the year 1568. So the Bishop's Bible actually wasn't the first either. It was a revision of the Great Bible of 1539. And the Great Bible was a revision of the Matthew's Bible of the year 1537. So you see, the King James Bible is actually the fourth one in the line, and it was just a revision of these other Bibles that came before it. Tyndale's work actually went into the Matthew's Bible as well. As far as the King James Bible being a revision, the manuscripts were certainly consulted and everything, and they were used, but I just want to make it clear that it was not just straight manuscript to English. That just was not the case. It was actually a fourth revision, which is kind of interesting. Something that in my studies and preparing, not just for my personal studies, but for preparing Bible studies for our audience and everything, there's been many times in the King James Bible where I have had to point out errors, especially in the New Testament, that the translators had. And to their credit, they had an older set of manuscripts. Let me take that back, a newer set of manuscripts. They didn't have the manuscripts like the Vatican manuscripts, the Sinaitic manuscripts, or the Alexandrian manuscripts, which are much better manuscripts in the sense that they're so old, and if you're a biblical scholar, they look at the time, older is better than the newer, because anybody can make a newer copy, if you get what I mean. So if it's older and if it lines up with all the older ones, there's no errors or, different things like that, then that's what they go with. So the King James translators did not have that. So I'd like to give that to their credit anyway. The newer Bibles that come out do have the newer translation or the newer manuscripts. They have used those. So some of the newer Bibles actually are a little more accurate in some regard than the King James Bible. The problem with the newer versions, and when I say newer, I'm talking the last 20 years or so, 30. The newer versions, like the NIV, for example, is a thought-for-thought translation. So say a scholar will look at a verse in, the manuscript or something like that, and he'll say, well, I think it means this. And he just translates the whole thought how he thinks. Well, what is his biblical belief? What denomination is he that would maybe influence how he changes that verse? So that's why a thought-for-thought, I won't study from a Bible that is a thought-for-thought. There's already a hard enough time trying to translate, the ancient languages and decide which English word is the proper one, much less having someone else change the whole thought for you. To the King James credit, the King James Bible's credit, it is a word-for-word translation, and that's why I will only study with that. They take one word from, the Hebrew, for example, and then they try translating it the best they can into the English language with the available words, that it means. So it's something to think about there. It's a big difference. I know some of the newer Bibles, it's spoken in English like we speak today, right? So it's easier to read. But it does take out some of the power, I think, from it too. I've even had non-believers tell me that, like when Jesus was chastising some people in the King James Bible, they said, man, it just sounded like so powerful, Jesus is really getting on their case. But when they read it in a newer version, say the NIV, it didn't really have the sting that it had before. From the King James Bible, there was another version that came out after that. It's not the King James, it's called the Revised Version, but it's a revision of the King James Bible. That came out in the year 1885. I actually use this at times, depending on what I'm doing. And then after that, the American Standard Version Bible, or ASV, which is from 1901. I like this one. I reference it sometimes as well because it has some of the newer manuscripts. So some of the inconsistencies that the King James has from the not so old manuscripts, the newer ones, is kind of fixed in the American Standard Version Bible. So it does help you. That may help you if you don't want to dive in, or maybe you don't know how to dive in to the ancient languages. That will help you. Something else I like about the American Standard Version Bible is you'll notice in the King James Bible, the word Jehovah, God's name, is only in the Bible 4 times. That's a mistranslation. So every time you look in your King James Bible and it says Lord in all uppercase, not the little uppercase, but the big one, that is actually supposed to be translated Jehovah, okay? It actually should occur in the Bible over 5,800 times, but it only appears 4 in the King James Bible. The American Standard Version gets it right, which I like that. You know, I think God's name should be in there. And Jehovah is the English translation of it, just like the word John is the English translation of John from the Greek. So don't be afraid to say Jehovah. Some people do. They think that they should say Yahweh. And you can say that, but you're talking in Hebrew, and people today don't speak Hebrew. So do whatever floats your boat. I just want to pass that along there. From the American Standard Version, this is the last one we're going to touch on, comes the Revised Standard Version Bible, written in 1952 by Dr. Moffat and Goodspeed. And so those guys did a really good job. So these are just trying to throw out this to you, some other versions of the Bible that will give you some updated manuscripts that go back to the further manuscripts on the Sinaitic, like I said. So they're going to be a little bit more accurate, especially along the New Testament version. I kind of want to wrap it up reading you a little bit from this, the book again, How We Got the Bible here. It's just a little note at the bottom of this page. Bear with me one second. So he's kind of summing up the book, basically, where I'm reading from you here. And he says, the story of the Bible is a remarkable story, far-reaching in scope, extending to both Old and New Testament, to the manuscripts that lie behind them, and to the translations that have been made from them. Ours, that would be you and I, is the privilege to study this remarkable story, God's story. It is the history of the most important book in the world. For those who have passed it on from generation to generation, for the legacy of their underlying devotion, we owe an incalculable debt, and we do. Every word that proceeds from the mouth of God is important. It's Matthew 4:4 he's citing. This is why we study about it, and this is why this book is written. The book of the Bible was written for us, and this book was written to help you understand how we got that book. So I hope this has helped you understand just a little bit, just kind of giving you a little bit more. You can read some other material like the book that I pointed out, and it will take you on a much deeper dive and help you. But I just want to pass that to you. I'd like to thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.